All right, in this section, we're going to walk through an introduction to the reporting environment. Depending on what version of SQL Server you're using will depend on what version of the development tools that you'll be using as well. If you're on SQL Server 2005 through 2008 R2, then you'll be using BIDS. However, if you're on SQL Server 2012 or later, then you will be using SQL Server Data Tools. And both of these are essentially just a shell of Visual Studios. Power users will use Report Builder 3.0. And then if you're working with mobile reports as of SQL Server 2016, then you can use the mobile report publisher to develop those dashboards as well as those mobile reports. One of the concepts that we need to explain in detail as we get into this section here is understanding the difference between projects and solutions. At the very top level here, at the highest level, we have solutions that will develop inside that shell of Visual Studios. And then within inside of the solution itself, we then have projects. And we have projects for each type of different business intelligence technology here. So we can have in our first project reporting services, and then we can have other projects within that same solution as well for integration services as well as analysis services. And then you can also have multiple projects within one solution that are of the same business intelligence type. So we can have multiple reporting services projects within a single solution. So what you'll see sometimes within an environment is we have a solution that we've created, and that solution ultimately is maybe for our data warehouse for our marketing team or data warehouse for our sales. And then I have an SSIS project, which is an ETL project that takes the data from the source and loads our data warehouse. And then I have an analysis services project, which takes that data warehouse and builds pre-aggregated data on top of it so that we can have faster and more efficient reporting. And then we have reporting services projects that we use within that context, and this is how we display and kind of view that data from our analysis services instance. And some developers prefer to put all of those different type of projects inside of a single solution so that they can easily find all of that data. My personal preference here is I like to have multiple projects, multiple project types. I like to have them in different solutions so that they're specific to their own solution. However, I do put multiple projects of the same type in the same solution from time to time. So if I am building out an ETL project with integration services, then I'll take integration services and I can build one project that loads staging, one project that loads the data warehouse, and then one project that maybe is the master project that controls the order of operations for all of my packages. And with reporting services, maybe I have a bunch of reports that are being built off of the same analysis services model or off of the same data warehouse, but I have different projects, right? So I might have one there, I'm building a bunch of reports for my human resources team. I have one project where I'm building a bunch of reports for my marketing team, so on and so forth. Well, in that instance, then yeah, I might have multiple projects, and then I store them projects within the same solution so they're easy to get to. The only other point I want to point out here is that within a project, we have the different items of that project, right? So within SSRS, we'd have multiple reports within that project. Within SSIS, we'd have multiple ETL packages within there that we've developed. And then within analysis services, we'd have the different cubes that we have developed within that project as well. All right, so that is projects and solutions. We'll explain this a little bit more as we actually get into Visual Studios and start building out our different solutions and projects. All right, so now we're going to jump over to our SQL Server Data Tools, or BIDS, that shell of Visual Studios, and we're going to walk through the Solution Explorer. We're going to discuss data sources, how to create those. We're also going to create our first data sets, and then we'll talk a little bit about the report folder, the design, and the preview tabs as well. All right, so now what I want to do is open up SQL Server Data Tools. From my Windows option here, I'm going to type in SQL Server Data Tools, and then click on SQL Server Data Tools 2015. Now keep in mind, if you're on 2008 or 2012, you might be using a different version of SQL Server Data Tools, and that's okay. But I'm going to be using SQL Server Data Tools 2015 for this course. And then once that opens up, there's a few things inside of the window here that we want to discuss. And what we'll do is we'll come back to all these different windows that are opening up here, and we'll explain each of these in details here in a few moments. But the first thing that I want to do here is I want to go ahead and show you how to create a new project. So we've opened up SQL Server Data Tools, we've opened up the shell of Visual Studios, and now we can create a new project here. And the way that we do that is we can come up to the File menu up here at the top and then go to New, and then go to New Project. And this will launch a new project. Keep in mind that you can also come up here and go to Open, and you can open an existing project or solution as well. So I'm going to come up here to New. I'm going to open up my new project here from the project window. And then you might not have all the different options that I have installed because I've installed the full version of Visual Studios here, but you should at least have a Business Intelligence tab. And within that, you probably have Analysis Services, Integration Services, and Reporting Services. But most importantly, you should have Reporting Services here. If you don't, then from the Business Intelligence tab itself, you will also see that you have a few different projects that you can open from there. I'm going to navigate down to Reporting Services, however, and select from that the Report Server project. We're not going to do the Report Server project wizard yet. We'll come back and discuss the wizard here in one of our couple next modules. And then for the Report Server project, what we want to do is go ahead and give this a name. So notice down here on the bottom that there's two different names that we can apply to this project. The first one is the project name. The second one is the name of the solution. So if you knew that you were going to want to put multiple projects within a solution, then you would want to name that solution accordingly so that it would make sense for what you're trying to do. So for our project name, though, we're going to call this Reporting Services, and then I'm just going to call this Reporting Services Recording or On Demand. That'll be fine. So Reporting Services On Demand. And then for the solution name, I'm just going to call this Reporting Services. All right, so we're going to have a solution name of Reporting Services, which is different than the project. So this project here is just for the on-demand training that we're doing in this course, whereas this Reporting Services it leaves room for us to really add additional projects to this solution. And then keep in mind that all of your projects that you create will go to your default location, and that default location is going to be stored in your Documents folder under your specific user account in the version of Visual Studios that you're using for that project. So you'll see here that I'm using Visual Studios 2015, and this is the default location where this solution in this project is going to be stored. Over here on the right, you can see that I can go ahead and opt in to create a directory for the specific solution I'm recreating here, which is Reporting Services. And then you can see that if you have source control set up, you can go ahead and add this immediately to source control as well. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and click OK here. And when I click OK, that's going to go ahead and open up that new solution for us. All right, so it looks like it did not automatically open up the project within this solution here. So we'll have to try to open that up or refresh that. So I'm going to go to the View menu up here at the top. And then from the View menu, you have your typical kind of Microsoft facing interface here, which are toolbars across the top, and then you can click on the drop down. And I'm going to try to just refresh the Solution Explorer by opening up the Solution Explorer here. So I'll click refresh. Still getting the same thing here. So what we'll do, since it's not opening up, is let's go ahead and open up that project here. So I'll open up a new version of File Explorer. I'm going to go into my Documents folder, go into Visual Studios 2015, go into Projects, and then go into Reporting Services. And then if I zoom in here, you can see that I've gone into Documents, Visual Studios 2015, Projects, my Reporting Services solution, which is the name that I gave that solution. And then I'm going to drill down into the folder. And what I want to do here is open up that project. So I'll select that project, go ahead and come down to the bottom here. Let's zoom out. Oh, I'm actually in the window of Windows Explorer here, so I was thinking I was in an open window. But what I can do is just double click on this project, and that will launch that in Visual Studio. So I'm going to double click on that now, and that's going to launch that project to open up here in Visual Studios. And then what I'm going to do is close out that other project, that other solution that was not quite working correctly there. So now we've opened up our project for Reporting Services. Couple things here that I want to point out. Notice first of all that we have a Solution Explorer over here on the right hand side of our screen. This is our name of our project. This is the first project that exists inside of our solution that we created. We could have multiple projects inside of this solution, but this is the only one that we have right now. Within that project, we have our shared data sources, our shared data sets, and then any individual reports that we've developed inside of this report or inside of this project. Another thing I want to show you just from an interface perspective is that we can pin and we can auto hide these windows. So if you're designing some reports here and you want to have a little bit more interface or a little bit more of a surface to work with as you're designing those reports, you can go ahead and auto hide these tabs here. So notice that when I click that tab, all of that area that was taken up in my development area is now free for us to develop and work in. If I click on Solution Explorer, it opens it back up. I can pull from that, but when I click away, it's going to automatically go ahead and hide again. So just keep that in mind. Over here on the left, we have our toolbox. We'll come back to the toolbox in a moment as well. What we can do though is if you want to pin this item back down because you don't want to have to keep looking for that and searching for that, you can click the pin icon here and that will automatically pin it back down so that it doesn't disappear. The other thing that we have here is we have our properties window, which is very important. So if I click on the properties window, it'll open up the properties window as well. And what we'll do is throughout the development of our different reports, we're going to be opening up that property window and changing properties on different items and objects. All right, another thing I wanted to show you here is notice that on my screen here, you can see the Solution Explorer is being displayed. However, on most screens, you're not going to see that. You're not going to see that automatically inside of Visual Studios by default. Now, if I had multiple projects in here, it would automatically show me the solution name. However, a lot of times you're only going to be working with a single project. If you want to display the solution name here, you can do that by going up to the menu at the top and going into the Tools tab. So we can go into Tools, kind of go down here. So inside of that Tools tab from the top, we want to navigate down a little bit and go into our Options. And then inside of the options, what we're looking for here is we're looking for projects and solutions. So I could come into my projects and solutions option, and then notice right here, it is going to tell me always show solution. If you want to kind of show the solution here always inside of your Visual Studios, you can click on always show solution. All right, so now if we click OK, then the solution will show up here at the top. So just keep that in mind. If you don't see the solution and you want to add that, you can do that very easily. Once again, by going into Tools, going into Options, and then going to Projects and Solutions, and then always show solution. All right, so the next thing we want to do now is we've created our solution, we've created our project. Now we want to go ahead and create a report. And the way we can do that is by right-clicking on the reports here and creating a report. So I can right-click here, and what I want to do is I can click on Add New Report, and that'll walk us through a wizard. We don't want to do that yet. I just want to add a new report very quickly here. So I'm going to click on Add, and then I'm going to go into New Item. And when I click on New Item, it's going to open up the different items that we have available. And I want to add a new report item to this project. So I'm going to click on Report for Report Project. And then I'm going to leave the default name here. We can come back and we can change this later. The RDL extension here stands for Report Definition Language. All right, so RDL stands for Report Definition Language, and this will be the extension for all of your reports that you develop and design here in Visual Studios. And then once I've given that a name, so once I've selected the item there up top, I'll go ahead and select my item and say, all right, I want a report. And then I give that report a name. Then the last thing I need to do is go ahead and add this named report, add that to our project here. So I'm going to click on the Add button, and that's going to add us a new report to our project. All right, and that's going to open up my design interface here. I'm going to slide this over a little bit, and then we'll walk through and kind of walk through the different sections that we have available. The first thing I want to show you here are the different tools that we have available in the toolbox. So remember I said we would come back and talk about the toolbox. I'm going to pin this down for a moment and just give you a very quick overview of it. We'll come back and work through a lot of these different items that we have. We have a text box here, we have a line, we have a table and a matrix. We have a section just to explain those two. You can add a rectangle to your report. You can add a list or an image. You can add charts and gauges and maps, and data bars and spark lines and indicators as well. So just a lot of the different items that are available here inside of our model. Now what I want to do is just kind of drag in one of these items here. So let's say the text box or the table, and I'm just going to drag that in and drop that into my design interface. And actually let's do something simpler like the text box because I don't want to fill out any required info right now. So I'm just going to drag a text box over here into the design interface. And that's all you have to do to add these different items to your report. Now, by the time we get to the end of this course, we'll have created many reports with all of these different items. So don't focus too much on that point right now or get lost in, the excitement of being able to build reports. Let's kind of stay focused here on the different items here in our interface. The other thing I want to show you here on the left is we just opened up that toolbox. Now I want to click on the report data. The report data here is the information that is specific to the report that you're currently developing. If we click on the built-in fields, you'll see there's a bunch of kind of built-in functions here that we can use. We'll talk about that when we get into talking about the SSRS expression language. Then you can parameterize these reports. That's a whole nother section that we're going to discuss. You can add images to your reports. You can do that right here by right-clicking on this and adding an image. And then we will also be adding data sources and data sets as well. And this will be mostly what you're doing is creating data sources, creating data sets, and then building out that report. that you want to design for your end user. All right, so this is where we're going to be doing a lot of that work at here. The next thing I want to show you here is the Design tab. So if you see up here at the top, if I click on the top here, you have a Design tab and then you have a Preview feature. Now, if you are on a version prior to 2016 SQL Server, then you don't see this first box here in the Design tab, and that's okay. You can ignore that. This is just one minor change, minor update that we now have inside of Reporting Services. And we'll come back to this and talk about this in a little bit more detail in one of our future sections. For most of you, what you're going to see right now is you're just going to see the basic design feature, which is this box right here, and then you'll see the row groups and the column groups down below. The Design tab here, this is where we're going to design and build out our different reports. The Preview tab is where we click once we've developed our report, and that's going to show us and render us the final result of that report and what it looks like. By looking at the Preview tab, then we'll go back to the Design tab and maybe resize some things, reorganize some things, restructure some of our thoughts and ideas so that the report looks a little bit better and is a little bit more uniform with maybe what the end user or the client was asking for there. So that's where we'll go, kind of preview it, make sure it looks good, and then come back to the Design tab and then make modifications there. Now down here at the bottom, you'll see that we have row groups and we have column groups. And this is just where we can see the groups for the column and row headers that exist within our reports. And we're going to get into this a lot more in detail as well as we get into discussing the differences between tables and matrices. A matrix, of course, is going to use those column groups across the top. So you can have both row and column groups with a matrix. And we'll get into specifics of how to set that up and how to configure that as well when we get into that section. Now, the next thing I want to show you here is really I want to discuss the three main objects that we're going to be working with as we're developing reporting services. And that's going to be our data sets and then also our reports. And each of these are going to take up a certain amount of time or a specific amount of time inside of your development efforts here. So there's really going to be three main efforts, like I said, or three main objects. And for those three main objects, there is a certain amount of development time that you should dedicate to each one of those, or that you will notice over time that you are dedicating to each one of those. The data source itself is usually going to be about 2% of your development effort. It's very easy to do. We'll create a data source here in just a couple moments. And then you also have the data set. The data set is going to take up about 49% roughly of your development effort. And then the report is going to take up also about 49% of your development effort. Now, the reason we tell you this and we go through this and discuss this is because most developers, at least originally, when they first start working with reporting services, feel like the data set is going to really take more of their development time. So they think that once I've done my data set and I've created that, that's about 80% of my development work is done. And typically, yes, I kind of agree with that. But the problem here is the report itself doesn't take much time to develop, but where you run into a lot of time with the report and a lot of the development process is the actual changing of very minute objects. So changing pixels or resizing columns, changing data types, changing some colors. As you take the report and you've developed it, maybe it did only take you 15% of the time originally, but then you submit that to the end user for validation and they start making some changes to that. And that's where you really are going to consume some of that time. So just make sure that if you're planning out a project, you're developing a project, that you account for the amount of time that it's going to take to give you that pixel perfect reporting. Remember, we talked about that in the intro to this class, that reporting services gives us that pixel perfect reporting where we can move stuff around and get it just right. And that's what you're going to encounter a lot of times when you get into that. So a lot of the work that you're going to do is going to be in that data set and getting the right amount of data and the right columns and the right rows and the right records into your report. But once you get that in and you start developing that report, there is going to be some back end work that you need to do as far as just cleaning up those columns and the rows and that kind of stuff. All right, so enough about that, enough about the amount of time it takes to design, enough about the interface here. What we want to do now is let's go ahead and create our first data source. There's a couple different ways we can create data sources, so I'll walk you through as many ways as I can. One way is we can click the New button up here at the top inside of the Report Data tab. So I can click the drop down for the New, and then I can go to Data Source, and this is one way that I can create a new data source. So the New option inside the Report Data tab. I can also click on the Data Sources folder. I can right click on that, and we can click Add Data Source here. Both of these will take you to the exact same window, so there's no difference as far as the window that is provided, but this is what it's going to do. Now, Once we're inside of here, we have a couple options. One is we can use an embedded connection and create a connection right here inside of our report, or if we've already created a shared data source, we can create a shared data source reference, or we can create this connection manager using a shared data source. For the first example here, we're going to go ahead and use an embedded connection. And the way that we do that is we need to pass in kind of our connection string information. So I'm going to click on the edit button over here to the right of my data source. And then I want to give it the server name wherever that database is located at. So all of my information is on my local machine here. So I'm going to point to my server name of localhost. I will caution you to never hit this drop down button here because it will spin as it tries to search your entire network for all the available servers. So be careful not to click on that. And then all I need to do now to complete this data source is just select the database name. And what we'll do for the first example here is we just want to bring in the AdventureWorks database. So you should have on your machine as part of your setup for this class an AdventureWorks database and an AdventureWorks DW database. And what we're going to bring in is just the AdventureWorks database. Now don't worry about the year that is appended to the end because all of these examples are going to work with every version of AdventureWorks. So it'll work with 2008, 2012, 2014, or 2016. So don't worry about that as much as just make sure you get the right database here, which is AdventureWorks database. All right, and then once we select our database, we've put in our server name, we've selected a database. Now we want to go ahead and test connection and make sure that we have the permissions required to access that database and bring the database back and the information so we can connect successfully there. Also keep in mind that if you connect to your local host server or any server, and then you click the drop down here and you do not see any databases, that is because you do not have permissions to read from those databases. All right, so just keep that in mind. If I click on this drop down here, and I'm not seeing the database that I want, or I'm not seeing any databases here, that is because my account that I'm logging into, my Windows authentication account, my domain account does not have the proper permissions to see those databases. So you'll need to reach out to your DBA for SQL Server there and say, hey, can you please give my account access? Or maybe they'll create some type of SQL Server authentication here and you'll type in a user and password, possibly, but if you don't see it, it's because you need permissions to that database. All right. So once we've put in our server name and once we've put in our database name and we've tested that connection, now we can click OK. And now if I zoom back in, you'll see that it has created that connection string information that is required to retrieve data from that database. Now the last thing I want to do here is I want to give this a name. I want to give this a name that makes sense, that is logical. So I'm going to call this AdventureWorks, and then I'm just going to give it embedded here on the end. All right, so I want to make sure that I know this is an embedded data source. All right, because this is embedded inside of my data set. Now, there's a way to tell if it's embedded or not, and I'll show you that here in a moment as well. And then once we've done that, we can come down here to the bottom and go ahead and click OK. Then if we come back up here, you'll see I have a data source that I have created inside of my report, and this is an embedded data source. Now, you can create an embedded data source or you can create a shared data source. If you are going to be using a data source like AdventureWorks or like a database from a server, and you know you're going to be using that database for a lot of reports inside of your environment, you absolutely want to create a shared data source. And the reason for that is because you cannot control if in the future at any given time, if the database name itself might change or if the server name itself might change. And if I have created all of these different reports here, and in every single report, I'm creating these embedded data sources, and I'm not using a shared data source up here on the top right, which I'll show you how to do in just a moment. If I'm not using a shared data source and I'm using these embedded data sources, then what happens is if I have 1,000 reports or 2,000 reports that are all using AdventureWorks and every single data source is embedded, then when that server name changes from 10.111 something like 10.111.222.1234, when it changes from that to something like 10.222.111.4321, then I have to go into every single one of those reports, thousands of reports, and I have to modify that data source connection manually, and I have to change it to point to the new server name. That is a lot of work. I have seen this happen in environments before where they had 2,000 or more reports out there in their report library and they changed their server name. Something happened that caused them to have to change their server name. And then it took 2 weeks and 20 developers to get that problem fixed, to go through every single report and update them manually. Whereas if they would have been using shared data sources over here, which we can find in our Solution Explorer, then they could have changed that one shared data source to point to the new server and it would have propagated down that connection string information to every single report that was using that shared data source. So keep that in mind from a administrative perspective, from an architecture perspective of creating these reports and reporting services. This is very important. So there's a couple ways that we can create shared data sources. I could come over here and go ahead and edit this data source that we already created. I could go into data source properties here, and instead of using an embedded connection, what we could do is say, hey, I want to use a shared data source reference. And then I can click on the new tab here. Since we don't already have a shared data source, I could click on the new tab, and this will actually create a shared data source. But I'm going to go ahead and close out of that. If I had already created data sources, I could click the drop down and I would see them. I would see the shared data sources that are available. All right, so we don't see any shared data sources available because we haven't created any. So I'm going to cancel out of this kind of editing the properties of this data source, and let's go ahead and just create a data source from scratch. So I'm going to come over here to the right, zoom back into my solution explorer, right click on shared data source, and then say I want to add a new data source. And by creating it here, this will be a shared data source that is available to all of the reports inside of this project. I'm going to go ahead and give this a name right away. So we'll call this AdventureWorks. We know this is going to be our AdventureWorks database. And then in order to create a connection here, we're going to do the exact same thing that we did before. And I'm going to click on Edit. Keep in mind also, and I didn't point this out previously, that there's a lot of different provider types that are available inside of SQL Server. So if I click on the drop down here, I can connect to an Azure SQL database. I can connect to analysis services, which we will show you in one of our later modules. I can connect to a SharePoint list, Oracle database, SAP, Teradata, OldDB, ODBC, a lot of different connection options that are available. So just keep that in mind as well. You're not limited to only SQL Server. Then when I click on that Edit tab, I'm going to do the same thing I did before. I'm just going to type in localhost for my server name. And then for my database name, I'm going to select AdventureWorks 2016 again, and then test connection, and then click OK. All right, and then I'll click OK again once I make sure that I have the name that I want. And now if I zoom back out and I expand that dialog box there for shared data sources, you'll see that we now have AdventureWorks data source available in our shared data sources. All right, so the next thing I want to do is we can come in here now and create another data source, and I want to compare and contrast the two of these side by side. So notice that when I created a shared data source over here, it does not automatically show up in my reports. You still have to add them in your reports if you want to take advantage of them. So I'm going to right click on the data sources. Actually, let's do it a different way this time. I'm going to come up to New, and I'm going to click New Data Source, and then I'll give this a name. I'm going to call this just AdventureWorks. So the other one was an embedded connection. We kind of appended to the end of that the embed keyword, so we know that it's embedded. I'm going to leave this, and what I'll do this time is I'm going to choose to use a shared data source reference. Then from the drop-down menu, I'm going to select AdventureWorks, and that's all I have to do because we've already created that connection. I can go ahead and click OK. And now if we come over here to the left, notice that I have an embedded connection and then I have a shared connection. And then notice that there's also a difference here between these two different connections. For example, this one down in the bottom left has a little arrow that lets me know that this is a shared connection. The embedded connection does not do that. The embedded connection does not show us a little arrow which indicates that it is embedded. So of course, you're not going to be typing embedded on the end of all of your connections. This is something I did for demo purposes. So in order to know immediately if you're using a shared connection or an embedded connection, you'll see that based on the icon that is displayed for your data source. All right, so that's how we can create data sources, however, inside of our Visual Studios. All right, so now that we have our shared data source added to this report, I want to go ahead and delete the embedded connection that we created earlier. Removing a connection is very easy. I can hit the X button up here at the top. Once I've selected it, that will delete it. I can also just right click on it here and go to delete as well. So I'm going to delete that embedded connection from our report, and now that has been removed. The next thing I want to do is I want to create another shared data source here, and this one is going to be for our AdventureWorks data warehouse. So I'll right click on shared data sources, go to add a new data source, and then once again, very easy process here. I'm going to type in AdventureWorks DW so that I know it's my data warehouse. I'm going to use the provider type for Microsoft SQL Server, and then click on the edit button over here so that we can modify that connection string information. The server name is going to be localhost. And then I will select my database from the drop down here, and the database is going to be AdventureWorks Data Warehouse, and I'm going to use the latest version that I have. Remember that this will work with any version of that AdventureWorks Data Warehouse that you have, but I'm going to choose AdventureWorks Data Warehouse 2016. And then of course I can test connection here, make sure that works. And then once I'm done connecting that server name and the database, then I'll just click OK. And then make sure it's named properly. I have my connection string information, and then we click OK again. All right, so now I have two shared data sources that we've created over here on the right-hand side. You got to be careful clicking them because every time I click it, it opens it up for editing. Just a single click is doing that for some reason. But I have two data sources over here. Now, notice that inside of my report, I still only have a single data source. And the reason for that is just because you add a data source on the right does not add it automatically. And the reason I point that out is because if you've worked with maybe integration services in SQL Server 2012 or later, then you're familiar with project connection managers, and project connection managers automatically add them to your SSIS packages. But reporting services does not work the same way. You create a shared data source and then you have to add that for each one if you want to use that in your individual report. And we do. So let's go ahead and go back over here, and I want to add an additional data source to this report using that new data source that we just created at the shared level. So we can right click on data sources, go to add data source, and then I'm going to say AdventureWorks, and this is going to be my DW. And then again, we're going to create a used shared data source reference. And then I can come in here and select AdventureWorks Data Warehouse, and then finally click OK. And now I have both of those connection managers added to this specific report. The key takeaway from this is A, creating data sources is very easy, very quick to do. Remember we said that's only going to be about 2% of your overall production time. B, creating these shared data sources means that if I have this AdventureWorks Data Warehouse data source being used in 100 different reports in this single project, if that server name ever changes, then all I do is come over here and click on this AdventureWorks data source that's shared. I change the server name in that shared data source, and then that information of that connection string will then propagate down to all of those reports automatically. I don't have to go through and touch every single one of those reports and modify them. This is a huge benefit from an architecting and administrative perspective. If you want to make sure that you're setting this up correctly, make sure to use these data sources as much as you can. Now, it's very possible you're going to build a report in this project, and that report is going to use some type of disparate data source, and you're only going to use that data source for that one report. Then, okay, by all means, go ahead and embed that into your report, because there's no reason to add to all the different data sources that are shared if you're only going to use it in that one report. But if you're going to use a database or a data source over and over and over again, make sure you share that data source.